They sold furs and slaves down the great rivers of Eastern Europe to Constantinople and Baghdad, brought back silk, spices, and silver which they hoarded in treasure troves back in their homeland, captured the world's largest city and founded the first Russian states. They were the Varangians, the Vikings of the East, and their story begins in Istanbul, once Constantinople, the greatest city of the ancient world and heart of a thousand-year-old empire. A place the Vikings first came to plunder and later, in a daring raid, penetrated its massive defenses to extract a privileged trade deal. And today most researchers believe that the appearance of the Vikings in Eastern Europe in the 9th century is closely connected to their desire for silver, since the Eastern world was most interested in the slaves and furs the Norse could supply. Having plundered the vast plains of Central Europe for centuries before pushing up the river systems to the Black Sea and eventually attacking Constantinople itself, and dozens of runestones scattered across modern-day Sweden still tell of the fearless Scandinavian warriors who died in faraway Greece and Turkey, while runestones, sagas, and the first Russian chronicle together preserve the story of the Vikings of Eastern Europe, though long before anything was written down. Vikings were already plundering the shoreline of the Baltic Sea, a fact confirmed when two remarkable Viking ships were found on the Estonian island of Saaremaa and excavated in 2011, proving the Norse had arrived here far earlier than any written record suggested, since radiocarbon dating of the bones and organic artifacts recovered from the site produced stunning results, showing the warriors buried there belonged to pre-Viking times. A class of professional fighters whose scattered grave goods and distinctive markings made clear they were Scandinavian sailors even before their precise origins could be pinned down. Two further sites in Poland prove that the Vikings colonized the estuaries of the great Central European rivers, specifically to control access to the fur and slave-rich plains of what are now Russia, Poland, and Ukraine. And the site of Trousseau near Elblag, excavated for 2 decades, reveals a vibrant industrial town of roughly 20 hectares dominated by a Viking military elite, complete with regular buildings, a harbor separated from the town center, and clear evidence of organized crafts and trade, functioning as a base for trafficking both people and goods all the way to the Black Sea. While on the western edge of modern Poland, near the mouth of the Oder River, lies Wallen, another major Viking trading post where local Baltic populations mix freely with Norse traders, and according to written sources, with people of many other ethnic origins as well, including Saxons, Rus, and Arab merchants drawn by the region's famous amber. And today, hundreds of modern reenactors gather there each year to stage mock battles and relive the life of the Scandinavian raiders who once used the Oder as an entry point into the great Central European plains. Farther east, the rivers flowing into the Baltic served as thoroughfares for trade with the south, and the most profitable route of all ran through Lake Ladoga, Europe's largest lake and Russia's northernmost expanse of fresh water, fed by the great river Volkhov, which for thousands of years served as the gateway from the Baltic into the depths of the Russian steppe, and beyond it, the civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean, and just south of where the Volkhov empties into the lake sits Staraya Ladoga, where archaeological excavations have uncovered what is often called the birthplace of Russia, with runic inscriptions and Scandinavian amulets dating back to 753, showing that Vikings had already come to dominate this strategic river junction almost half a century before the first recorded raids struck Western Europe, making it the earliest confirmed site of Scandinavian presence anywhere in the region. The true starting point of the story of how a small band of ruthless pagan traders and warriors, drawn irresistibly by the riches of the eastern Mediterranean, built an entire Eastern empire. The artifacts uncovered at Staraya Ladoga mostly date to the 9th and 10th centuries, the height of Viking activity, when their ships plied the seas and rivers of the north and pushed deep into the landmass of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Poland in search of legendary southern wealth, capturing slaves and plundering furs which they carried to Baghdad and Constantinople in exchange for silver coins, much of which eventually made its way back to Scandinavia. And while most researchers agree the Norse exported silver from around the Caspian Sea and imported furs taken from Eastern Europe, there remains some scholarly disagreement over the precise origins of certain goods, with furs in particular valued less for practicality than for the prestige they conferred. These Vikings, known in the East as Varangians, built an enduring and immensely wealthy empire on the trafficking of precious goods and slaves with the great empires of Byzantium and Baghdad, and by the early 8th century they had already conquered key trading posts along Russia's rivers, a fact confirmed 100 kilometers south of Staraya Ladoga at Rurikovo Gorodishch on the banks of the Volkhov opposite Novgorod, Russia's first capital, where archaeology students continue to uncover items such as a blue glass bead from a Viking woman's necklace or an axe head, confirming that these graves held some of the earliest Viking warriors to dominate the area. Finds that are then sent to museum laboratories in Novgorod, where technicians preserve waterlogged wooden objects using glycol to replace the water in the wood cells before freeze-drying the excess, and according to Alexia Ruddy, curator of Novgorod's Viking exhibition, The chronicles, confirmed by archaeological finds, record that this settlement was founded by a Scandinavian prince named Rurik who arrived with his druzhina, his warband, around 840 AD. And it is from this Finnish name for them, corrupted over time, that the word ruse emerged, the term by which this new military elite would be known for centuries, and although no artifacts directly name Rurik himself. 9th century finds from Rurikovo unmistakably connect to Scandinavian culture, and it is possible that the word ruse originally referred not to a country or a people at all, but simply to Rurik's own social group or dynasty, a dynasty that would go on to rule Russia for hundreds of years, a history still commemorated on a monument in Novgorod, where Rurik's son Igor was still a child when his father died, leaving Rurik's loyal companion Oleg to rule as regent until the boy came of age. Oleg soon faced a crisis of his own. Since Rurik had allowed friendly Scandinavians to sail down the Dnieper and establish a new settlement under leaders named Askold and Dyer, and the city of Kiev, standing on a bend in that river, became their base for pushing further down the river system toward the Black Sea, and in 860 the city of Constantinople witnessed the arrival of a Viking flotilla while the emperor was away fighting the Arabs, and although the raiders were dissuaded from attacking the heavily fortified city itself, they mercilessly pillaged the coastline instead, including the Prince's Islands where the city's religious leaders had taken refuge, marking the first time the Vikings had laid eyes on the wealth of the imperial capital, a sight they would not forget. And Oleg, angered that Askold and Dyer had grown so powerful through their own attacks on Byzantium, the greatest power in the world at the time, eventually murdered them and captured Kiev for himself. Their tombs still lying beneath a church on the riverbank outside the city, and Oleg then turned his own ambitions toward Constantinople, known to the Vikings as Miklagard, and in 907 AD the Viking fleet once again appeared on the Bosphorus, sacking coastal villages and Christian monasteries, and in a famously daring maneuver Oleg had wheels fitted to his ships so they could be hauled overland, crossing the Golden Horn to threaten the city directly. And though unable to actually seize the ultimate prize, he settled instead for a privileged trade agreement and strategic alliance with the imperial city, the heart of the Christian world, a deal that transformed the twin kingdom of Kiev and Novgorod into the most powerful state in Eastern Europe, and one that also began supplying mercenaries for the emperor's personal bodyguard, a lucrative arrangement since Varangian guardsmen were paid 40 gold pieces a year plus food, lodging and special bonuses, marking the beginning of the golden era of the Vikings in the East. Today the burial mounds of Staraya Ladoga still catch the morning sun, one of them once holding the remains of Oleg himself, whose attack on Constantinople remains the high point of the Viking Eastern saga, and our primary source for this history is the chronicle written by the Christian Orthodox monk Nestor, buried in Kiev's Monastery of the Caves, the first monastery built along the Dnieper, though Nestor's chronicle never records what became of Askold and Dyer's own followers, who, according to historian Pr Przemysław Urbańczyk, likely fled westward into modern-day Poland, a region that offered no organized military opposition, a sedentary and calm population, natural protection from the Baltic Sea to the north via Wallin, Kołobrzeg, Truso and Elblag, security from Kiev and Novgorod to the east, and swampland shielding them from Poles and Elboslavs elsewhere. Though Urbańczyk cautions against imagining this as some great mass migration of peoples moving freely between Normandy, York and Iceland. The rise of Poland as a corridor for these cosmopolitan Viking elites is dramatically illustrated by the remarkable cemetery discovered at Bodzia near the Vistula River, excavated by Andrzej Buko, who describes it as entirely untraditional, unlike any other cemetery in Europe, since every single grave is rich, with no poor burials at all, marking it clearly as a cemetery reserved for the social elite. Containing graves from different periods and cultures belonging to a multi-ethnic community that controlled a critical point on the Vistula, including traders whose equipment shows clear commercial activity and warriors accompanied by their families, who controlled this vital thoroughfare linking the North and Baltic Seas via the Vistula and Bug rivers all the way to the Black Sea and Byzantium, making control of this route one of the surest paths to wealth. And the central grave at Bodzia held a young male warrior killed in battle, his jaw hacked off, buried alongside two women, possibly slaves, along with his weapons and armor. And when Buko brought in strontium isotope and DNA specialists to trace the origins of these skeletons, the results confirmed they were indeed foreign Scandinavian artifacts scattered widely along the northern and central Vistula. Though Bodzia stands out as one of the few sites where isotope and genetic analysis definitively proved this foreign origin, and coins from Germany and England found in the graves date the cemetery precisely to the late 10th and early 11th century, the period when the very first Polish kingdom was rising under King Mieszko of the Piast dynasty, and the Viking remains suggest Scandinavians held far more influence over local politics than historians once believed. With Buko arguing that Vikings from Kiev, the very people who built Viking Russia, traveled down the Vistula and Bug precisely where Poland began, sparking, if not single-handedly building, the origins of the Polish nation by bringing crucial know-how and sowing the seeds of the country in these territories. During the 10th century, The Polans, a Slavic tribe inhabiting central Poland, began expanding at the expense of neighboring Slavic groups, and Polish sources trace the pious dynasty back to a simple trader, with the first true king Mieszko a pagan ruler, uniting all the Slavs of central Poland under his authority, though his daughter would go on to marry the Danish Viking king Sven Forkbeard, and his own son Swiatopolk married the daughter of Vladimir of Kiev. Connections that sit at the very heart of ongoing debates over Viking influence in Poland's founding, since more and more sites continue to emerge, such as the grave of Swiatopolk at Bodzia, whose burial arrangement, according to Buko, shows unmistakable signs of a Scandinavian or Norman burial with some Western influence, further confirmed by grave goods including a warrior's belt ending in a bident marked with a cross. The bident being the emblem of Rurik's line and the cross indicating a connection to Swiatopolk, son-in-law of the Polish king Bolesław the Brave, and this constant movement of peoples up and down the rivers of Central and Eastern Europe shows that the Vikings were not perpetually at war with their neighbors, and may often have simply provided the military element within an otherwise multicultural society. Evidenced by interesting discoveries showing that people in these territories maintained contact with steppe peoples, chiefly the Khazars, whose characteristic burial chambers with niches, distinct from more regular graves, turn up repeatedly and point clearly to Khazar cultural influence. Key artifacts from the excavation at Trousseau are displayed in the small museum at Elblag, including scales that highlight how the Vikings valued goods in weights of hack silver, coins, jewels, or other objects that could be melted down into ingots, along with combs, a favorite Scandinavian ornament, and necklaces of glass beads imported all the way from Constantinople, plus amulets, especially Valkyrie figures believed to protect Viking warriors, and amber, which ranked as the third most desired trade good after slaves and swords, immensely popular and abundant along these Baltic shores with a strong southern market waiting to buy it, worked locally into jewelry before export through the trading networks the Vikings had built across the region. But the single most profitable trade of all, witnessed and recorded by many chroniclers, was the slave trade, since the river systems of Russia and Poland cut straight through land inhabited by Slavic peoples, and the Rus Vikings of Kiev plundered this land for captives to sell to the great empires of the south and west, with one Spanish traveler from Seville recording that Varangians and Normans brought slaves to Prague sourced from Kiev and Krakow. And it is said that by the 10th century Arab slave markets were flooded with captives from Eastern Europe, with several million dirhams flowing out from the Caspian region into Europe in exchange, while slaves, furs, amber and walrus ivory all poured into the markets of the Mediterranean and Central Europe down the rivers of Russia and Poland, giving the kings of Kiev almost exclusive access to the richest cities in the world, though the journey down the Dnieper's dangerous and fearsome rapids. Navigable only during the high water of summer forced traders to portage their cargo around them on foot, leaving them dangerously exposed to attack from fierce nomadic tribes such as the Khazars, Bulgars, and Pechenegs, and most researchers today believe there was little real distinction between merchants and warriors in Scandinavian culture, since in a 10th century world with almost no centralized power across most of this territory, it was essentially impossible not to also be a warrior. And Scandinavian graves regularly contain not just weapons but also scales and silver, suggesting the occupant was equally a trader, making it hard to neatly separate Scandinavians from Vikings at all. Within roughly 20 years, Viking warriors and traders had penetrated deep into the Russian plains and forests, building camps and trading posts along the rivers and reaching the Black Sea, and after striking their trade deal with Constantinople, they gathered yearly convoys of ships at Kherson, still a thriving Black Sea port today, before sailing on to the Great City, a feat made possible only by the distinctive Viking ships uncovered on Saaremaa Island, vessels that were light, shallow-keeled and fast, ideal for both raiding and trading. And according to Jan Bill, curator of the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo and a leading expert on Viking ships, this combination of lightness, speed and seaworthiness gave the Scandinavians a mobility unmatched at the time, enabling a style of warfare the kingdoms of Europe found extremely difficult to counter, and modern replicas suggest these ships could reach top speeds of 20 to 25 knots. Though on longer voyages they likely cruised more slowly at around 3 to 6 knots, and while the Vikings built many kinds of ships for both war and transport, one persistent myth Bill is eager to dispel is the idea that Viking ships sailed all the way down the Russian rivers to the Black and Caspian Seas, since there is no actual evidence this happened, but rather solid historical and archaeological evidence that the Vikings switched to different, more suitable means of transport as the landscape demanded, and the great trade expeditions from Kiev to Kherson and beyond relied on a complex network of bases, with ships able to withstand the rapids only at high water, while at low water traders portaged their goods overland on horses before reloading onto boats downstream for the continued journey to Kherson, where seagoing vessels waited to carry them onward to Constantinople. Oleg's successor Igor, Rurik's son, led unsuccessful attacks against Byzantium and the Arab world and was ultimately killed on a punitive raid, and his son Sviatoslav allied with Constantinople and succeeded in destroying the Khazar Empire, only to be killed himself during a trade expedition by the Pechenegs while portaging around the Dnieper Rapids. In the civil war that followed among Rurik's descendants squandered a century of gains and radically transformed the nature of the Viking Russian state, though it did not stop the trading up and down Russia's rivers, as confirmed by the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered these Vikings on the Volga and described their bizarre pagan funeral rites, including the sacrifice of slave girls, portraying men who by Arab standards remained deeply barbaric, tattooed head to toe and rarely bathing. The civil war among Rurik's descendants eventually left Vladimir as sole ruler, and he expanded the kingdom of Novgorod and Kiev into Poland and eastward, boldly demanding the hand of Princess Anna, sister of the Byzantine emperor, in exchange for military support in crushing a rebellion. And after famously weighing all the monotheistic religions of his day, Vladimir chose to become an Orthodox Christian, embracing Slavic customs at his court. While his illegitimate son Swiatopolk married into the Polish royal dynasty, after being exiled from Kiev, following the succession of Yaroslav the Wise, arguably the greatest Viking king of Russia, and over time the fates of the royal dynasties of Denmark, Norway and Sweden became bound up with the plains of Russia and Poland. And although Vladimir and his Christian successors continued drawing on Scandinavia for military manpower, their cities grew steadily more multicultural. With historians noting no evidence of permanent conflict during the 9th and 10th centuries, since the local population was likely Slavic in some areas and Finnish in others, with Scandinavians occupying particular economic niches, and there is no sign that the silver and fur trade ever operated outside Scandinavian involvement, though over time the Vikings were gradually assimilated into the local population, their distinct influence becoming imperceptible as they intermarried. Had children and were absorbed into the surrounding Slavic world, a process that touched even the ruling class, with artifacts at Rurikovo Gorodište continuing right up to the 15th century, even though distinctly Scandinavian remains disappear by the 11th. The goods gathered across these vast territories eventually found their way to the great Scandinavian market towns of Köping near Oslo, Hedeby in Denmark, and Birka in Sweden, where archaeological remains reveal a flourishing trade connecting the farthest northern seas to the two great capitals of the Mediterranean world, Baghdad and Constantinople. And in 2004, the shores of what was once Constantinople revealed a sunken Byzantine-era port where Viking flat-bottomed ships would have docked directly alongside typical Mediterranean vessels, their traders bringing back not only silver but silk, fine beads and jewels before undertaking the long, perilous journey home. And as these market towns grew, so did the wealth and power of the chieftains who controlled them, who reinforced their profits through trade with military strength and strategic alliances, including marriage, to secure the steady flow of goods. And one particularly rich site, believed to have been the base of the so-called Jomsvikings, was one of the wealthiest towns in the entire Scandinavian sphere despite sitting firmly within Slavic ethnic territory, with written sources describing Jomsborg as a huge city on the southern Baltic coast. The description matched by the archaeological discovery of extensive evidence for trade, export and craft production confirming the site's identity beyond doubt, and a runestone standing on Gotland commemorates the greatest battle fought by the Jomsvikings, when their commander attempted to seize the Swedish throne on the plain at Uppsala, invoking Odin and his daughter in one of the rare pagan references found on any runestone, and according to the sagas, written down centuries later by Icelandic scribes. The Jomsvikings were mercenaries who frequently fought as allies of the Danish king Harald Bluetooth, some possibly of Slavic origin themselves, since fighting for a king for plunder and for money was considered an entirely honorable pursuit, and for hundreds of Viking men fortunes were made and lost across the plains of Poland and Russia, though their true political influence on Slavic tribes remains hotly debated, with scholars distinguishing two separate waves of Scandinavian arrival in Polish territory, first as settlers in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, who lived in ordinary houses as part of local communities, and left behind equipment typical of people not engaged in warfare, and later in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, as a more mobile developed group whose graves do contain swords, and although Moravian influence on the formation of the Polish state was also significant. King Mieszko I ensured continued Scandinavian influence in the region by marrying his daughter to the Danish king Sven Forkbeard, possibly as a counterweight to the eastward spread of German imperial power, and through this marriage to a Polish princess, Sven Forkbeard's own empire stretched from Poland to the British Isles, and the taxes he could levy across the entire Baltic coastline made him the most powerful Viking king of his era. Though he was hardly the only Viking monarch whose fortune was bound up with the East, since Olaf Tryggvason served as a mercenary for Vladimir before heading north, marrying an Irish queen, becoming the first Christian king of Norway, and dying in battle against his Danish rival around the year 1000, while the greatest Viking of them all was arguably Harald Hardrada, commander of the imperial Varangian Guard, who made his fortune as a mercenary yet never forgot his descent from Norway's royal line, learning statecraft as a Christian ruler from some of the most powerful emperors of his age, before finally leaving the imperial court in 1040 to travel back along the rivers of Russia to his homeland, where he seized the Norwegian throne before turning his ambitions toward England in 1066, just as the sun was setting on the entire Viking era. Winning his first battle against the Saxon king at Fulford near York, before dying a heroic death shortly after at Stamford Bridge, now a quiet Yorkshire village remembered chiefly for that final Anglo-Saxon victory. And during this broader transition into the medieval period, the ship itself became a kind of social and administrative metaphor, with tax systems in Scandinavia even organized around land divided into ship crew units. A structure that captures how deeply naval culture had shaped Norse society as a whole. Harold left behind hundreds of Scandinavian Varangians who still spoke and wrote in the Norse tongue, serving within the Palace of Constantinople that overlooked the strategic straits between Europe and Asia, close by the Hagia Sophia, once the largest church in the Christian world, where a Varangian guardsman named Halfdan left his name carved in runes high in one of the upper galleries, and runic inscriptions turn up in unexpected places well beyond Byzantium, including on two famous lion statues at the Arsenal in Venice, originally guarding the harbor at Piraeus, carved with the memory of a warrior named Harsi cut down in battle after winning great gold, while a runestone in a churchyard in Thuringe, Sweden, commemorates another Scandinavian warrior who died in imperial service, since runestones referencing Greece remain among the most common memorial monuments across Sweden. Ingvar the far-traveled stands out as the most famous freebooting Viking of the East, serving at the court of Yaroslav before becoming a Byzantine mercenary, and winning a celebrated battle at Sassardy in Georgia, a land the Vikings called Cirkland, though only one ship out of the many that sailed with him from Sweden ever returned, and 26 separate runestones commemorate the men who perished on that expedition, including one raised by a mother named Tola in memory of her son Harold. Ingvar's brother, who traveled valiantly far for gold, fed the eagle in the east and died in the south in Cirkland, having set out from Sweden to build his fortune and finding death instead. By the end of the 11th century, the Scandinavian states had become fully Christian, trade grew steadily more peaceful, and the once empty spaces of Europe filled with new states, closing off most remaining opportunities for large-scale plunder, while the final tragic massacre of the Varangian Guard at Manzikert by the Turks marked the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire itself, and even today the precise ethnic origins of the first kings of Poland and Russia remain genuinely uncertain. Much like the very definition of Viking itself, since these Scandinavian warriors colonized, plundered, traded, and raised families throughout the central and eastern plains of Europe, their bloodlines eventually mingling with local populations and their descendants adopting local languages. Yet their contribution to the founding of these new states remains recorded forever in chronicles, and carved permanently into stone lodged deep within the very roots of Russian and Polish history.